Some hearts break so completely that they forget how to mend. Others build walls so high that love itself seems like a distant memory from another man's life. Titus. Iron Caldwell knows both truths intimately. For 20 years, this giant of a cowboy has lived alone on his ranch in Sagebrush Ridge, watching women come and go from his employment like seasons that never quite take hold. At 62, Iron stands 6'6", with hands that know hard work and a heart that turned to stone the day he buried his young wife. No maid has lasted more than a month in his house. They can't stand his silence, his cold stare, or the way grief hangs in every room. But when Francesca steps off the afternoon stage with her worn satchel and steady gaze, she doesn't run from his gruffness. She plants herbs in his dusty yard and asks questions that cut straight to his soul. Will this gentle woman be the one to finally thaw a heart frozen in time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over Sagebrush Ridge like it had every day for the past 20 years, painting the weathered, clappered house in shades of amber and gold. Titus Iron Caldwell stood on his front porch, coffee mug in one massive hand, watching the light creep across his 1,000 acres of rolling grassland. At 62, he still cut an imposing figure against the endless sky, 6'6", of weathered muscle and bone, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of 2 decades worth of silence. The hand-carved rocking chair beside him sat empty, as it had every morning since Margaret died. He'd built it with his own hands during the winter of their first year together, when she was heavy with the child they'd never gotten to hold. The wood had aged to a deep honey color, smooth from years of Margaret's gentle rocking as she watched the sun rise over their land. Now it served as a monument to what once was, creaking softly in the morning breeze like a ghost keeping him company. Iron took a long sip of his black coffee and surveyed his domain. The ranch sprawled in all directions, dotted with red cattle, and crossed by weathered fence lines that he and his hands maintained with the same methodical precision he applied to everything in his carefully ordered life. 3 ranch hands worked for him now, down from the dozen he'd employed in his prime. Old Pete Martinez had been with him since the beginning, a wizened cowboy who understood the value of comfortable silence. Young Tommy Jackson, barely 22, possessed the kind of endless energy that reminded Iron painfully of his younger self. And there was Buck Sullivan, steady and reliable, a man who asked no questions and expected no explanations. The men respected Iron, even feared him a little, but they gave him the wide berth that grief demanded. They'd learned not to linger after work, not to invite conversation, not to mention the string of housekeepers who'd come and gone like tumbleweeds caught in a dust devil. 23 women in 20 years, each one arriving with hope and leaving with relief. Some lasted a week, others nearly a month, but none could bear the weight of Iron's silence or the way sorrow seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. Margaret's presence lingered everywhere, carefully preserved like a shrine to better times. Her china still graced the dining room hutch, though Iron ate his meals standing at the kitchen counter. Her books remained on the bedroom nightstand, bookmarks still holding places she'd never returned to read. Her garden had long since surrendered to the desert, but Iron couldn't bring himself to plough it under. Instead, he let the wild grass reclaim it, as if nature itself was gentler than his own hands when it came to erasing her memory. The house itself reflected 2 decades of bachelor neglect. What had once been a warm home filled with laughter and dreams had become a functional shelter maintained but not loved. Paint peeled from the window frames, curtains hung faded and limp, and dust gathered in corners that no woman had been allowed to truly clean. Iron performed the basics, cooking simple meals, washing dishes, keeping his clothes clean, but anything that smacked of homemaking, of creating comfort rather than mere survival, felt like a betrayal of Margaret's memory. The townspeople of Sagebrush Ridge had long since given up trying to draw iron back into the community. The pastor no longer extended dinner invitations. The widow Thompson had stopped bringing casseroles after the third one was returned untouched. Even Doc Patterson, who delivered half the babies in the county and buried the other half of their grandparents, had learned to keep his visits brief and professional. Iron appreciated their respect for his boundaries, even as he sometimes caught himself listening for voices that never came. It was into this carefully maintained isolation that Francesca Moreau stepped off the afternoon stage on a Tuesday that began like any other. Iron watched from his porch as the dusty coach rolled to a stop in front of Henderson's General Store, same as it did every Tuesday and Friday. But this time, instead of the usual commercial travelers and occasional drifters, a woman emerged, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing a traveling dress that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. She was handsome, rather than beautiful, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a simple hat and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Iron guessed her to be somewhere in her late 30s, old enough to have lived but young enough to hope. She moved with purpose, not the tentative steps of someone unsure of her destination, but the confident stride of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through. Iron had been expecting her, of course. He'd placed the advertisement in the Denver paper 6 weeks ago, same as he had 22 times before. Housekeeper wanted for working ranch. Room and board provided. Must be willing to work hard and mind own business. The responses always came in waves. Young women seeking adventure, older women seeking security, desperate women seeking escape. They all left seeking something else entirely, but something about this woman's letter had been different. No flowery language about bringing warmth to his home, no promises to cook his favorite meals or mend his clothes with loving care. Just simple, straightforward sentences. I am experienced in household management and ranch life. I am seeking steady employment and value privacy. I am recently widowed and understand the need for quiet. It was signed simply F. Moreau, with an address in Boston that suggested refinement but no pretension. As Iron watched, Francesca approached old Henderson for directions. The storekeeper pointed toward Iron's ranch, and she nodded her thanks with the kind of polite efficiency that spoke of good breeding and better manners. She shouldered her bag and began the 2-mile walk to his place without complaint or request for transportation. Iron found himself oddly impressed by her self-reliance, even as he dreaded the inevitable conversation that would follow. By the time she reached his front gate, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Iron had moved inside, unwilling to appear eager or welcoming, but he watched through the kitchen window as she took in the property with the same measured assessment she'd given the town. Her gaze lingered on Margaret's overgrown garden, the empty rocking chair, the general air of masculine neglect that surrounded the place like morning fog. When she knocked, 3 firm, confident raps, Iron waited a full minute before answering. He opened the door to find her standing straight and calm, satchel at her feet, hands folded in front of her like a schoolteacher addressing an unruly class. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice carried the faint trace of an accent. "French, perhaps, or French-Canadian. I am Francesca Moreau. I believe you are expecting me." Iron nodded, taking in her appearance more closely. She was prettier than he'd expected, with fine bones and intelligent eyes that met his gaze directly. But there was something in her posture, a carefully controlled composure that spoke of recent loss and hard-won strength. It reminded him uncomfortably of his own reflection in the years immediately following Margaret's death. "You're expected," he said simply. "Room's out back." If she was put off by his brusque welcome, she didn't show it. "Thank you. Might I see the kitchen first? I prefer to understand my workspace before settling in." Her directness surprised him. Most of the women who'd answered his advertisement had been either intimidated by his size and manner or overly eager to please. Francesca seemed to view their arrangement as a business transaction, nothing more or less. Ian led her through the house, pointing out the basics. Kitchen, dining room, his bedroom and office, both off limits. The spare room where she could read or sew if she chose. She asked practical questions about his preferences, meal times, laundry schedules, as if memorizing a set of instructions rather than trying to ingratiate herself. The maid's quarters were in a small building behind. The main house, originally built for Margaret's mother, who had never made the journey west. It contained a narrow bed, a dresser, a wash basin and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Previous housekeepers had found it cramped and isolated. Francesca examined it with the same thorough attention she'd given everything else. "This will do nicely," she said, setting her satchel on the bed. "What time would you prefer breakfast?" 5:30, Ian replied, testing her resolve. "Very well. I assume you keep coffee beans rather than ground." "You assume correctly." "Good. Ground coffee loses its flavor too quickly." She turned to face him fully, and for a moment they simply studied each other like two card players trying to read each other's hands. "Is there anything else you need to know about me, Mr. Caldwell?" Ian considered the question. The usual inquiries about references, experience, personal history seemed suddenly irrelevant. Something in her manner suggested that whatever had brought her here was neither his business nor his concern, and he found himself respecting that boundary. "Can you cook?" he asked finally. "Yes." "Can you keep house without rearranging everything?" "Yes." "Can you mind your own business?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "That, Mr. Caldwell, is my greatest talent." Ian nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Supper's at 6. Don't expect conversation." "I wouldn't dream of it," she replied, and somehow he believed her. As he walked back to the main house, Ian found himself wondering if perhaps this time might be different. Not because he wanted it to be, he'd learned not to want things that could be taken away, but because Francesca Moreau seemed to understand something the others hadn't. She wasn't here to fix him or save him or bring life back to his empty house. She was here to work, to exist quietly in the margins of his life without demanding more than he was willing to give. It was, Ian reflected as he settled into his evening routine, exactly what he thought he wanted. Time would tell if he was right. 3 weeks passed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Francesca moved through Ian's house like morning mist, present but unobtrusive, transforming the space without disturbing its essential character. Meals appeared at precisely the right times, hearty breakfasts that sustained a man through long days of physical labor, simple lunches that could be eaten quickly, and suppers that somehow managed to be both satisfying and comforting without crossing the line into intimacy. She kept to their unspoken agreement about conversation, speaking only when practical matters required it. "The coffee is running low. I've mended the tear in your work shirt. There's a storm coming from the west." Her voice became as familiar as the sound of wind through the eaves, a constant that Ian found himself unconsciously listening for, but it was the small changes that unsettled him most. The kitchen window now stayed clean enough to actually see through. Fresh herbs appeared in a small pot on the windowsill. Nothing fancy, just practical things like thyme and sage that improved the flavor of simple meals. The persistent squeak in the porch steps disappeared one afternoon while he was out checking fence lines. When he asked about it, Francesca simply said, "I had some oil left over from maintaining the stove." Ian told himself he didn't care about these improvements, that they were simply the natural result of having competent help. But he caught himself noticing them, appreciating the way sunlight now streamed unobstructed through clean glass, or how the house no longer smelled of old grease and neglect. It bothered him that he noticed. It bothered him more that he liked what he noticed. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Ian had been moving the heavy oak bookshelf in his office, trying to reach a water stain on the wall behind it that had been annoying him for months. The shelf was heavier than he'd expected, loaded with 20 years' worth of accumulated books, papers, and memories. As he wrestled it away from the wall, something fluttered to the floor behind it, a small leather-bound book that must have fallen and been forgotten. Iron bent to retrieve it, intending simply to return it to its proper place. But as he lifted the book, it fell open in his hands, revealing pages covered in careful, feminine handwriting. His eyes caught a few words before his conscience could stop him. James would have laughed at my attempts to bake bread in this primitive oven. He knew he should close the book immediately, return it to Francesca with an explanation and apology. This was clearly her personal journal, fallen from her satchel during one of her cleaning sessions. But something in those few glimpsed words held him frozen, the book trembling slightly in his large hands. James. She had mentioned no James in her brief introduction, no husband living or dead, against every principle of privacy and decency he'd ever held. Iron read on. The entries were dated, starting from her first day at the ranch and working backward through what seemed like months of travel. Her handwriting was precise, educated, the thoughts expressed with a clarity that spoke of genuine intelligence and deep feeling. September 15th. Mr. Caldwell is exactly as I expected from his letter, a man who has built walls so high that he can barely see over them himself. But there is kindness here, buried under 20 years of dust and sorrow. I see it in the way he gentles his horses, in the careful repair of useful things. Margaret was loved deeply, and that love still echoes in every corner of this house. Iron's throat constricted. She had noticed Margaret's lingering presence, understood its significance, without explanation or discussion. But it was the next entry that stopped his heart entirely. September 10th. The nightmares came again. I woke calling for Emma, reaching for a child who will never answer. 3 years since the fire, and still I expect to find them in the next room. James reading his paper, Emma playing with her cloth doll. Dr. Harrison says the grief will fade, but I think he mistakes healing for forgetting. I don't want to forget. I want to learn to carry their memory without it crushing me. The book slipped from Iron's nerveless fingers, falling closed on the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Francesca had lost not just a husband, but a child. She had fled west, not seeking adventure or escape from poverty, but running from the ghosts of a family consumed by fire. The careful composure he'd admired, the quiet efficiency that never quite became warmth, it was armor, just like his own, forged in the same fires of loss and guilt. Iron stood frozen in his office for long minutes, staring down at the innocent-looking journal as if it were a snake coiled to strike. He had violated her privacy in the most fundamental way, invaded the sacred space where she kept her deepest pain. But more than that, he had learned something about her that changed everything. She understood his grief not as an observer, but as a fellow traveler on the same dark road. The sound of thunder rumbling in the distance broke his paralysis. He could hear Francesca moving about the house, securing windows and bringing laundry in from the line. A storm was coming, one of those late-season tempests that could drop inches of rain in hours and turn the usually dry creek into a raging torrent. If the roads washed out, as they often did, she would be trapped here with him through the night. Iron carefully placed the journal on his desk and went to help with the storm. Preparations, though, Francesca seemed to have everything well in hand. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had weathered storms before, both literal and metaphorical. When the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows, she was lighting lamps against the gathering darkness. "It looks to be a hard one," she observed, as lightning split the sky outside. "They usually are this time of year," Iron replied, acutely aware of the journal sitting in his office like an accusation. "Roads might wash out." I suspected as much. I've prepared accordingly. The storm hit with the fury of something that had been building pressure for weeks. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing seeking entry. The lights flickered once, twice, then died entirely, leaving them in the golden circle of lamplight that seemed suddenly intimate and fragile. Francesca moved through the darkened house with calm purpose, setting additional lamps in strategic locations and checking that the windows were properly latched. Ian found himself watching her more closely than usual, seeing her anew through the lens of what he had learned. The steady competence that had impressed him took on deeper meaning when he understood it as hard-won wisdom rather than natural talent. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, when she found him standing awkwardly in the kitchen, clearly struggling with something. "You seem troubled. Is there something wrong with the storm preparations?" The direct question gave him the opening he needed. "I found something of yours," he said slowly, "behind the bookshelf. I'm afraid He stopped, unable to find words that would adequately convey both his transgression and his regret. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something that might have been resignation. "My journal, yes. I read some of it. Before I realized what it was. I'm sorry." Francesca was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but careful. "What did you read? About James? About Emma?" The names felt strange on his tongue, too intimate for the formal distance they had maintained. "About the fire." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "I see. I had no right." "No," she agreed quietly. "You didn't. But I suppose it was bound to happen eventually. Secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in a house this quiet." Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the windows, and Ian felt the weight of the moment settling between them like dust after an explosion. Everything they had built, the careful boundaries, the respectful distance, the unspoken agreement to exist in parallel rather than intersection, had been shattered by his momentary weakness. "I won't tell anyone," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I know you won't." Francesca moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the storm-lashed landscape. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two people running from ghosts, thinking we can outrun our own shadows." The observation hung in the air between them, honest and painful and strangely liberating. For 3 weeks they had maintained the fiction that they were simply employer and employee, that their careful courtesy masked nothing deeper than professional respect. But grief recognized grief, and loss called to loss across any barrier that politeness could erect. "How long ago?" Ian asked quietly. 3 years, a tenement fire in Boston. I was visiting my sister when it happened." Her voice remained steady, but Ian heard the cost of that steadiness. "I came home to ash and silence. Margaret's been gone 20 years, Ian offered in return. "Fever took her, and the baby." They stood in the storm-lit kitchen, two people who had learned that the world could be torn away in an instant, that love was no protection against loss, that survival sometimes required becoming someone harder and colder than you ever thought you could be. The intimacy of shared understanding was more frightening than anything they had acknowledged before. "Perhaps," Francesca said finally, "we might try being honest with each other. It seems we're past pretending otherwise." Ian nodded, though honesty felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. "Perhaps we might." The storm raged on outside, but inside the house something had shifted irrevocably. The careful walls they had built around their hearts had not fallen, but the first small cracks had appeared, letting in light that was both welcome and terrifying. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, as if the world had been washed clean and hung out to dry. Ian woke earlier than usual, his sleep having been fitful and broken by dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him feeling unsettled. The conversation with Francesca had changed something fundamental between them, though he couldn't yet say whether that change was for better or worse. He found her already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was something different in her bearing. The wooden cross necklace that she wore, a simple thing he'd noticed before but never really seen, caught the morning light as she moved. It had belonged to her mother, he somehow knew, though she had never mentioned it. There was something about the way she touched it occasionally, an unconscious gesture of comfort that spoke of old faith and older grief. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said without turning around. "I trust you slept well despite the storm." "Well, enough," he replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Roads passable. Old Pete rode out early to check. He says the main road's clear, though the creek crossing is still running high." Iron poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun burn off the last wisps of morning mist. The storm had left everything looking fresher, more alive somehow. Even Margaret's old garden seemed less melancholy in the bright light, the wild grasses that had claimed it swaying gently in the breeze. It was while he stood there that he noticed the small bouquet of wildflowers on the windowsill beside Francesca's herbs, simple prairie flowers, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans, wild lupine, arranged in a mason jar with no particular artistry, but considerable care. They hadn't been there the day before. "Pretty flowers," he observed, not quite a question. Francesca glanced over, and he caught something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "I found them by the creek this morning. It seemed a shame to leave them for the cattle to trample." Iron nodded, but as the days passed, he began to notice a pattern. Wildflowers appeared regularly near Francesca's workspace, not ostentatious bouquets, but simple gatherings of whatever was blooming in the meadows and draws around the ranch. He never saw her picking them, but somehow they materialized with the same quiet inevitability as clean shirts and hot meals. What he didn't tell her was that he had begun leaving them for her to find. It started unconsciously on his morning rides to check the herd. He would see a particularly fine stand of flowers nodding in the breeze and find himself stopping to gather a few. Not many that would have been too obvious, but just enough to brighten whatever corner of the house Francesca was working in that day. He told himself it was simple courtesy, the kind of small gesture any decent man might make for a woman working hard to maintain his home. But the truth was more complicated. Something about her careful tending of those flowers, the way she changed the water daily and removed wilted blooms with surgical precision, touched a part of him that had been dormant for 20 years. The change in their daily interactions was subtle but unmistakable. Francesca began humming while she worked, not loudly but just enough to fill the oppressive silence that had ruled the house for 2 decades. The melodies were half-remembered things, folk songs and hymns that spoke of homes and hearth, and the comfortable rhythm of lives lived in harmony with the seasons. Iron found himself listening for those soft sounds, adjusting his own movements, so that he might catch a snatch of melody drifting from the kitchen or laundry room. Once he caught himself humming along with a tune he recognized from his own childhood, before remembering himself and falling back into his customary silence. "You have a fine voice, Mr. Caldwell," Francesca observed one afternoon, appearing in the doorway with a basket of mended clothes. "I heard you humming with the chorus." Iron felt heat rise in his cheeks like a schoolboy caught in mischief. "Didn't realize I was making noise." It wasn't noise, it was music. She set the basket down and began sorting clothes with her usual methodical care. Music is one of the few things that survives loss unchanged. James used to say that songs were memories we could carry without them weighing us down. It was the first time she had spoken of her late husband with anything approaching warmth, and Iron found himself hungry for more details about the man whose ghost had haunted her journal entries. But before he could frame a suitable question, Francesca had moved on to other matters, leaving him with only the lingering sense that she had offered him a small gift of trust. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through horses. Iron had always prided himself on his way with animals, a talent that seemed to run counter to his reputation for hardness with human beings. His horses were well-trained but not broken, responsive to his commands but retaining their essential wildness. It was a balance that required patience and understanding rather than dominance. Francesca had mentioned in passing that she had ridden as a girl but was badly out of practice. Iron surprised himself by offering to remedy that situation, though he told himself it was purely practical. A woman living on a ranch should be able to handle a horse in case of emergency. He chose Buttercup, a gentle mare with the patience of a saint and the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. The horse was past her prime but reliable, the kind of mount that would take care of her rider rather than testing their skill. Francesca approached the animal with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, studying Buttercup's temperament before attempting to make contact. "She's beautiful," Francesca said, running her hands along the mare's neck with instinctive knowledge of how to soothe and reassure. "What's her history?" "Bought her as a 3-year-old from a family heading back east," Iron replied, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate Francesca's shorter legs. "She's been with me 15 years now, reliable as sunrise." The first lesson was tentative, focused on reacquainting Francesca with the basics of balance and control, but Iron quickly realized that her skill was rusty rather than absent. She had been properly taught as a young woman and needed only confidence to regain her seat. By the third lesson, she was cantering around the paddock with a grace that spoke of natural ability refined by good instruction. It was during the fourth lesson that disaster struck. Buttercup shied at a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock, nothing more than a normal horse reaction to potential danger. But Francesca, still rebuilding her confidence, lost her balance and began to slide sideways from the saddle. Iron moved, without thinking, stepping forward and catching her as she fell, his large hands spanning her waist and steadying her against his chest. For a moment, they stood frozen, closer than they had ever been, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes and feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his ribs. Time seemed suspended in that amber moment, heavy with possibility and fraught with danger. Iron was acutely aware of how small she felt in his arms, how her hands had instinctively gripped his shoulders for support, how the scent of lavender soap and honest work clung to her hair. He could have kissed her then. The inclination was there, sudden and sharp as hunger after a long fast. Instead, he set her carefully on her feet and stepped back, putting safe distance between them. "You all right?" "Yes," she replied, though her voice was slightly breathless. "Thank you. I'm afraid I'm rustier than I thought." "You're doing fine, just need practice." But as they walked back to the house in careful silence, Iron knew that something had shifted again between them, something that had nothing to do with riding lessons and everything to do with the way she had fit so perfectly in his arms, as if she belonged there. October settled over Sagebrush Ridge with the slow inevitability of an old man settling into his favorite chair. The days grew shorter and the nights crisp with the promise of winter, but something had awakened in the heart of the Caldwell ranch that seemed to push back against the dying of the year. Iron found himself rising each morning with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain what exactly he was looking forward to. The change was most evident at mealtime, where once Iron had eaten his meals standing at the kitchen counter, wolfing down food that was fuel rather than pleasure. He now found himself lingering at the simple wooden table Francesca had begun setting with Margaret's good china. She had asked no permission for this small luxury, simply appeared one evening with plates that hadn't seen use in 20 years, polished to gleaming perfection and set with quiet ceremony.
"They're too beautiful to hide in a cabinet," she had said when Iron raised an eyebrow at the unexpected elegance. Margaret would have wanted them used, not preserved. Iron couldn't argue with that logic, though the sight of Margaret's rose pattern
China filled him with a complex mixture of guilt and gratitude. Francesca had somehow managed to honor his late wife's memory while gently coaxing him back into the world of the living. a feat that 20 years of well-meaning friends and neighbors had failed to accomplish. It was over these civilized dinners that Iron began to discover the mind behind Francesca's quiet competence. She had brought books with her, not the romantic novels that might have been expected, but substantial works of literature and philosophy that suggested serious intellectual curiosity. When she mentioned having read Emerson's essays, Iron surprised himself by admitting he had always found the man's optimism somewhat naive. "Perhaps," Francesca replied thoughtfully, "but there's something to be said for choosing hope over despair, even when experience suggests otherwise." Especially then, the conversation that followed was the longest they had shared since the night of the storm, ranging across topics that Iron hadn't discussed with another soul in decades. Francesca had opinions, carefully considered and clearly expressed, about everything from the future of the cattle industry to the role of education in frontier communities. More surprising still, she listened to Iron's own thoughts with genuine attention, asking questions that suggested she valued his perspective. "You're well-educated for a ranch woman," Iron observed one evening, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Francesca's smile was gentle but pointed. "I'm well-educated because I chose to be, Mr. Caldwell. My circumstances may have changed, but my mind remains my own." It was a gentle rebuke that left Iron both chastened and impressed. He was beginning to understand that Francesca's decision to work as his housekeeper was born of necessity rather than limited options, a temporary arrangement that allowed her to heal while maintaining her dignity and independence. The Worn Recipe book she consulted while cooking told its own story of a woman determined to create comfort and tradition wherever she found herself. The carefully transcribed instructions, annotated with notes about altitude adjustments and ingredient substitutions, spoke of generations of women passing down their knowledge through the simple act of feeding their families well. Under Francesca's influence, Iron's meals became events rather than interruptions. She somehow managed to prepare his favorite foods without his having told her what they were, intuiting his preferences through careful observation and subtle questioning. When she presented him with a perfect beefsteak dinner accompanied by potatoes roasted exactly as Margaret used to make them, Iron felt a pang of something that wasn't quite betrayal, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. "How did you know?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "You mentioned once that you missed proper roasted potatoes." The rest was simply a matter of observation and experimentation. The care she took with such details touched him more deeply than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just the skill of her cooking, but the attention to his preferences, the way she seemed to understand that food could be an expression of caring without crossing into intimacy. Their evening routine began to extend beyond the boundaries of necessity. After dinner, while Iron settled accounts or read correspondence, Francesca would often remain in the kitchen with her own book or writing materials. The companionable silence that developed between them felt different from the isolation Iron had cultivated, warmer, less defensive, touched with the possibility of conversation if either of them chose to break it. It was during one such evening that catastrophe struck in the form of a sick calf. Young Tommy Jackson arrived at the kitchen door just as Iron was finishing his coffee, hat in hand, and worry written across his face. "Boss, we got a problem down at the barn. That red calf, the one born late in the season, she's down and not looking good." Iron was on his feet immediately, reaching for his coat and medical supplies. Cattle were his livelihood, but more than that, they were his responsibility. A sick animal couldn't wait for morning or convenient timing. "What do you think it is?" Francesca asked, appearing with a lantern already lit. "Could be anything," Iron replied, surprised by her readiness to help. "Might be a long night. Then you'll need coffee and someone to fetch things while you work." Iron wanted to protest that this wasn't her responsibility, that nursing sick cattle was hardly part of a housekeeper's duties, but one look at her determined expression told him that argument would be both futile and ungracious. The calf was indeed in bad shape, fever, labored breathing, and the dull eyes that spoke of serious illness. Iron worked by lamplight, administering medicine and trying to coax the animal to take water, while Tommy and Francesca assisted with quiet efficiency. The night stretched on, punctuated by Francesca's periodic trips to the house for hot coffee and clean rags. It was near dawn when the crisis passed. The calf's fever broke, her breathing eased, and she managed to stand on wobbly legs to nurse from her anxious mother. Iron sat back on his heels, exhausted but relieved, only then realizing that Francesca had been beside him through the entire ordeal. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning it more than the words could convey. "You're welcome." She was tired too, he could see, but there was satisfaction in her voice. "She's going to be fine." As they walked back to the house in the pearl-grey light of early morning, Iron found himself acutely aware of Francesca's presence beside him. The shared work, the comfortable cooperation, the way she had anticipated his needs without being asked, it all felt dangerously like partnership, like the kind of easy collaboration that marriage was supposed to provide. The thought should have alarmed him, should have sent him retreating back into the safety of isolation. Instead, as he watched Francesca move efficiently around the kitchen, preparing breakfast despite having been awake all night, Iron felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The desire to share his life with another person. It was a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering you wanted to learn how to fly. November arrived with a cold snap that sent the cattle clustering around the windbreaks and reminded every living thing on the ranch that winter was no longer a distant threat. But inside the Caldwell house, something warmer than the wood-burning stove had taken hold, a change so gradual that Iron almost didn't notice it happening until he found himself automatically reaching for 2 coffee cups each morning instead of 1. The silver locket containing Margaret's photograph had been a constant weight in his vest pocket for 20 years, worn smooth by countless unconscious touches. He'd carried it like a talisman, a physical reminder of the love he'd lost and the vow he'd made never to risk such pain again. But lately, Iron found himself reaching for it less frequently, his fingers finding other destinations, the handle of his coffee cup, the brim of his hat, or sometimes, almost without thinking, brushing against Francesca's hand when she passed. Something across the table. It was Francesca who finally voiced what they'd both been carefully not acknowledging. "You've been different lately," she said one evening, as they lingered over dinner. "Lighter, somehow, as if you've set down something heavy you'd been carrying." Iron considered her words, rolling them around in his mind like stones in a tumbler, wearing away the sharp edges until they felt smooth enough to examine. "Maybe I have," he admitted finally, "though I'm not sure when it happened." "Grief has its own seasons," Francesca observed, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "Sometimes we hold on to it past its natural time, because letting go feels like another kind of betrayal." The conversation that followed was unlike any Iron had experienced since Margaret's death. Francesca spoke of her own struggle with survivors, guilt, the way she'd punished herself for being absent when her family needed her most. Iron found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for decades, not just of Margaret's death, but of their life together, the simple joys and small irritations that made up the texture of married love. "She would have liked you," Iron said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "Margaret, she would have appreciated your kindness, and she would have wanted you to be happy," Francesca replied softly. "Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies." The truth of that statement settled over Iron like a warm coat on a cold day. For 20 years, he'd believed that honoring Margaret's memory required him to remain frozen in the moment of her death, as if moving forward would somehow cheapen what they'd shared. But Francesca was suggesting something different, that love could coexist, that the heart was large enough to hold both memory and hope. the town social at Grange Hall, provided an unexpected test of Iron's evolving feelings. He'd avoided such gatherings for decades, sending his regrets with automatic politeness whenever invitations arrived. But when Francesca mentioned that she'd been invited by Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Iron surprised himself by offering to escort her. "You don't need to feel obligated," Francesca said carefully. "I'm perfectly capable of attending alone." "I know you are," Iron replied, "but I'd like to go with you." The dance was a revelation. Iron had forgotten how it felt to move through his community as part of a pair, to introduce someone with quiet pride, to feel the comfortable weight of another person's hand on his arm. Francesca charmed everyone she met with her genuine interest in their lives and stories, her ability to listen without judgment, her gentle humor that never had sharp edges. But it was when Calvin Morrison, drunk on moonshine and emboldened by the crowd, made crude comments about Iron's pretty new housekeeper that something fundamental shifted in Iron's understanding of his own feelings. The rage that rose in him was swift and protective, the kind of fury that came not from wounded pride, but from seeing something precious threatened. "You'll apologize to the lady," Iron said, rising from his seat with the slow inevitability of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. Right now, Morrison, perhaps remembering belatedly who he was dealing with, sobered quickly. "Didn't mean nothing by it, Iron. Just having a bit of fun. Apologize." The word was spoken quietly, but every person within earshot heard the danger in it. Morrison mumbled his regrets to Francesca, who accepted them with grave dignity, and Iron settled back into his chair. But his blood was still running hot, his hands slightly unsteady with the realization of how much he cared about her reputation, her feelings, her place in his life. Later, as they drove home under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck, Francesca touched his arm gently. "Thank you for defending me," she said, "though I should mention that I've handled worse than Calvin Morrison." "I know you have," Iron replied, "but you shouldn't have to, not anymore." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Not anymore. As if he were making some kind of promise, offering some kind of protection that went beyond the bounds of employer and employee. When they reached the ranch, neither of them seemed eager to end the evening. They sat on the porch in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and feeling the crisp air that promised the first frost wasn't far away. "Would you like to dance?" Iron asked suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they did her. "Here? Now?" But Francesca was smiling as she said it, and when Iron stood and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation. They danced slowly on the porch to music only they could hear, Iron's large hands spanning her waist, Francesca's arms resting lightly on his shoulders. They moved without speaking, letting their bodies say what words hadn't yet been brave enough to attempt. When Iron spun her gently under the starlight, Francesca laughed, the first time he'd heard her truly laugh, and the sound went through him like warm honey. It was inevitable that the dance would end with them standing close together, close enough that Iron could see the pulse fluttering at the base of Francesca's throat, close enough that when he lowered his head, there was no question about what was going to happen. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question as much as a statement. Francesca's lips were soft and warm, and she tasted of coffee and hope and the possibility of new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Iron rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing harder than the simple dance should have warranted. "Francesca," he whispered, her name a prayer in the darkness. "I know," she replied, and in those two words was the acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them, everything they'd been afraid to name. Standing there under the vast Montana sky, Iron felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble away. For the first time in 20 years, he was ready to risk his heart again, ready to believe that love could be stronger than loss, that tomorrow could be brighter than yesterday, ready to live instead of merely surviving. The weeks that followed their first kiss unfolded like the pages of a story Iron had never dared to imagine. Each morning brought small revelations, tender moments stolen between the ordinary tasks of ranch life. A touch of hands while passing, the coffee pot, a shared glance across the kitchen table that spoke volumes, the way Francesca's face lit up when Iron appeared in the doorway, as if his presence alone was enough to brighten her day. Iron found himself working in his small forge. Again, for the first time in years, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil filling the crisp air. His hands remembered the skills Margaret had so admired, the ability to transform raw iron into objects of both beauty and function. But this time, he wasn't making horseshoes or repair work. This time, he was creating something that had no practical purpose except to make one person smile. The hand-forged iron rose took shape slowly, petal by petal, each curve hammered with painstaking care. Iron worked on it in stolen moments when Francesca was occupied elsewhere, heating and shaping the metal until it resembled a flower that would never wilt, never fade, never disappoint the person who tended it. As he worked, he thought about permanence and impermanence, about the things that lasted and the things that were precious precisely because they didn't. Francesca's influence on the ranch extended far beyond the walls of the house. She had begun making suggestions about operations, small improvements that revealed a sharp business mind and an understanding of efficiency that impressed even old Pete, who was resistant to change on principle. That woman's got a head for numbers, Pete observed one afternoon as they watched Francesca reorganize the feed storage system with mathematical precision. Reminds me of your Margaret, the way she can see how to make things work better. The comparison should have stung, should have felt like a betrayal of his first wife's memory. Instead, Iron found it oddly comforting. Margaret had been practical and intelligent, quick to spot inefficiencies and gentle in her suggestions for improvement. That Francesca shared those qualities seemed less like replacement than like recognition, as if life was offering him not a substitute for what he'd lost, but a new chapter in the same story. Their conversations grew deeper and more intimate. As the days shortened, Francesca shared stories of her childhood in Quebec, the daughter of a blacksmith who had taught her to value both education and honest work. Iron spoke of his dreams beyond ranching, his love of reading, his fascination with the changing technology that was slowly transforming the West, his secret ambition to someday see the ocean. "We could travel," Francesca said one evening, as they sat by the fire, her sewing in her lap and Iron pretending to read, while actually watching the way the firelight played across her features. "When the ranch is more established, when we've built something solid here." The casual "we" in her statement made Iron's heart skip. She was planning a future that included him, speaking as if their partnership was already decided, already real. It was a traveling photographer passing through town who captured the moment Iron later realized marked the true beginning of their courtship. The man had set up his equipment in the town square, offering portraits to anyone willing to pay his modest fee. Iron had never seen the point of photographs. They seemed to him a poor substitute for memory. But something about the way Francesca looked at the photographer's samples changed his mind. "I'd like a picture of us," he said impulsively, "together." The photograph, when it was ready a week later, showed them standing close but not quite touching, Francesca's hand resting lightly on Iron's arm, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that were serious but not stern. Iron was surprised by what he saw there, not the broken, grieving man he'd carried in his mind for 20 years, but someone who looked capable of happiness again. "We look like a couple," Francesca observed, studying the image with gentle satisfaction. "We are a couple," Iron replied, and saying it out loud made it feel real in a way that all their stolen kisses and meaningful glances hadn't quite achieved. The Iron Rose was finally completed on a Tuesday evening in late November. Iron had waited for the perfect moment to present it, wanting the gesture to feel natural rather than overly ceremonial. That moment came as Francesca was putting the finishing touches on dinner, humming softly as she worked, unaware that Iron was watching her with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for beautiful sunsets or approaching storms. "I made something for you," he said simply, producing the rose from behind his back. Francesca turned, her eyes widening as she took in the delicate metal flower. Each petal had been shaped individually, the stem twisted with careful artistry, the whole piece achieving a balance between strength and grace that spoke of the skill of its maker. "Iron," she whispered, accepting the rose with hands that trembled slightly. "This is beautiful. You made this?" "Figured real flowers die too quickly," Iron said, suddenly self-conscious about the gesture. "This one will last." Tears gathered in Francesca's eyes as she turned the rose in her hands, examining each carefully crafted detail. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. The thought, the time, the skill." She looked up at him with such warmth that Iron felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Thank you." That night, for the first time since Margaret's death, Iron allowed himself to hope for more than mere survival. As he and Francesca made love with a tenderness born of mutual understanding and careful trust, Iron felt something long frozen finally begin to thaw. Her touch was healing, her whispered endearments a balm to wounds he'd carried for 2 decades. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Francesca traced lazy patterns on Iron's chest while he played with her hair, both of them reluctant. "To let sleep claim this perfect moment, we should talk about marriage," Iron said quietly, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Yes," Francesca agreed simply. "We should." They made their plans in whispers, speaking of small ceremonies and practical arrangements of merging 2 lives that had learned to exist independently, but now chose interdependence. As dawn approached, Iron found himself imagining a future he'd never dared to envision. Children's laughter echoing through the house, years of shared meals and shared dreams, the comfortable familiarity of growing old with someone who understood both his strength and his vulnerabilities. For the first time in 20 years, tomorrow felt like a promise rather than a threat. December arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made every breath visible and turned the water in the horse troughs to sheets of ice each morning. Iron and Francesca had settled into the rhythm of an engaged couple, making quiet plans for a spring wedding while the ranch prepared for the hard months ahead. There was a contentment in their daily routines that Iron had never expected to feel again, a sense of rightness that made even the harshest weather seem manageable. It was while looking for Iron's account ledgers to help him plan the spring cattle purchases that Francesca made the discovery that would shatter their carefully constructed peace. She had been searching his desk for the current year's records when she accidentally knocked over a stack of papers, sending documents cascading across the floor in a flutter of white that reminded her uncomfortably of snow. As she knelt to gather the scattered papers, her eyes caught familiar letterheads: the First Bank of Sagebrush Ridge, the County Tax Assessor's Office, legal firms from as far away as Denver. But it was the bold red stamps across several of the documents that made her blood run cold. Final notice, demand for payment, foreclosure proceedings initiated. With hands that trembled despite the warmth of the office, Francesca spread the papers across Iron's desk and began to read. The picture that emerged was devastating in its completeness. The ranch, Iron's beloved land that had been in his family for 30 years, was drowning in debt. Mortgage payments 3 months behind, tax bills accumulating interest and penalties, feed suppliers demanding payment for deliveries made months ago. The most recent document, dated just 2 weeks prior, was a formal foreclosure notice from the bank. 60 days to bring the account current or face seizure of all property and assets. Iron had been living with this knowledge, carrying this crushing burden, while courting her and making plans for their future. The man who had seemed so strong, so capable of protecting and providing, was losing everything he owned. Francesca sank into Iron's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the deception. Not intentional deception, perhaps. She understood now why he had been so reluctant to accept her financial help with household expenses, why he had insisted on maintaining the fiction that she was merely his employee even after their relationship had deepened. He had been protecting her from the knowledge of his failure, keeping her at arm's length from a disaster that could destroy them both. But as she continued reading, other details emerged that painted an even more complex picture. Letters from potential buyers offering insulting amounts for prime ranch land. Correspondence with cattle dealers suggesting Iron had been slowly selling off his herd to meet expenses. A heartbreaking letter to Margaret's sister back east, written but never sent, explaining why he might not be able to maintain the ranch that had been Margaret's dream as much as his own. When Iron returned from his morning rounds, stamping snow, off his boots and calling out a cheerful greeting, he found Francesca sitting motionless at his desk, surrounded by the evidence of his financial ruin. The color drained from his face as he took in the scene, understanding immediately what had happened. "Francesca," he began, his voice rough with something that might have been shame or desperation or both. "How long have you been hiding this?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. Iron stood in the doorway, like a man facing execution, his shoulders slumped with the weight of secrets finally exposed. "The trouble started about 5 years ago. Drought, cattle, prices falling, expenses rising faster than income. I thought I could work my way out of it." 5 years! Francesca's composure cracked slightly. "You've been struggling for 5 years and never said a word?" What was I supposed to say? Iron's own voice rose, defensive and raw. That I was failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at? That I couldn't even maintain the ranch Margaret loved? That I was too proud and too stubborn to ask for help until it was too late? The papers between them seemed to pulse with accusation, 60 days' worth of borrowed time spread across the desk like a countdown to disaster. Francesca stood, slowly, her mind racing through possibilities and calculations with the sharp clarity that emotional shock sometimes provided. "I have money," she said simply, "from James's business investments, more than enough to settle these debts and modernize the operation." Iron's reaction was immediate and vehement. "No. Iron, be reasonable." I said no. He moved into the room, his massive frame radiating wounded pride and masculine stubbornness. "I won't take charity from you or anyone else. I won't become the kind of man who lives off his woman's money while pretending to be the head of the household. This isn't charity. It's partnership. It's emasculation." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of hurt and anger across the room. "You think I haven't considered every option? You think I haven't lain awake nights trying to figure out how to save this place? Taking your money would make me nothing more than a kept man, and I won't live that way." Francesca felt her own temper rising, fueled by frustration and disbelief at his stubborn refusal to accept help. "So you'd rather lose everything than swallow your pride? You'd rather see this ranch sold to strangers than admit you might need assistance? If that's what it takes to maintain my dignity, yes." The words hung in the air between them, cold and final as a death sentence. Francesca stared at the man she had fallen in love with, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Here was the pride that had kept him isolated for 20 years, the same stubborn independence that had prevented him from seeking help when help might have made a difference. "Then you're a fool," she said quietly, and Iron flinched as if she had struck him. "You're choosing pride over practicality, ego over love, solitude over partnership. Everything I thought I had found in you, the wisdom, the strength, the ability to face hard truths, it's all just another kind of cowardice." "Get out," Iron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What? Get out. Leave. Tonight." His face had gone pale, but his jaw was set with the kind of determination that had seen him through 20 years of grief. "I won't have you here when the Ija Bank comes. I won't have you watch me lose everything. Iron, please, go." The word exploded from him with such force that Francesca stepped backward, genuinely frightened for the first time since she had known him. "Take your money and your pity and your superior Eastern education and get out of my house. Find yourself a man who can provide for you properly instead of wasting your time on a broken-down cowboy who can't even hold on to his own land." Francesca stood frozen for a moment, torn between the urge to fight harder and the recognition that Iron's pride had wounded him beyond the reach of reason. The man she loved was drowning, and he was pushing away the only person offering to throw him a rope. "I'll pack my things," she said finally, her voice hollow with defeat. "But Iron, when you're sitting in this empty house with nothing but your precious pride for company, remember that you chose this. You chose to be alone." She left him standing among the scattered papers of his failure, already retreating into the shell of isolation that had protected him for 2 decades. But as she packed her few belongings with mechanical precision, Francesca was already formulating a plan. Iron might be too proud to accept her help directly, but there were other ways to fight for the man you loved, even if he was too stubborn to fight for himself. The first night without Francesca stretched before Iron like a desert highway, with no end in sight. He sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by the foreclosure papers that had destroyed his carefully constructed happiness, and tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt oppressive, weighted with the memory of soft humming and gentle laughter that would never again fill these rooms. He had driven her away to protect her, he told himself. Better that she should hate him for his pride than pity him for his failure. Better that she should remember him as a strong man who had chosen solitude than a weak one who had accepted charity to maintain the illusion of success. But as the hours crawled by and the coffee grew cold in his cup, Iron began to question whether protection that caused such pain could truly be called love. Francesca, meanwhile, had taken a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in town, but she was far from idle. If Iron thought that pride could solve their problems, he was about to learn that determination was a much more powerful force. She spent her first morning in the town library, poring over land records and business filings, mapping out the full scope of Iron's financial difficulties with the methodical precision of a general planning a campaign. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than she had initially understood. Iron's debt was substantial but not insurmountable, especially for someone with access to the kind of capital that James's business acumen had provided. More importantly, the ranch itself was fundamentally sound. The land was prime grazing territory, the water rights were secure, and the improvements Iron had made over the years represented genuine value that the right investor could appreciate. Afternoon. Francesca had arranged meetings with the bank president, the county assessor, and 2 of the larger ranchers in the valley. She also sent telegrams to financial contacts in Denver and Boston, men who had respected James's business judgment and might be willing to extend that respect to his widow's recommendations. The partnership agreement she drafted that evening was a masterwork of legal and emotional strategy. Rather than a simple loan or gift, she proposed a genuine business partnership between herself and Iron, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities that would preserve his dignity while providing the capital injection the ranch desperately needed. She would provide financing and business management expertise. He would contribute the land, livestock, and operational knowledge that made the venture viable. But Iron, drinking alone in his empty house, was past the point where logic could penetrate, the fog of his self-recrimination. He had failed at the one thing that had defined him since Margaret's death, his ability to maintain the ranch that represented everything he had built with her. The fact that economic forces beyond his control had contributed to the crisis was irrelevant. He was the owner, and the responsibility for both success and failure rested squarely on his shoulders. When old Pete arrived the next morning to find Iron sitting motionless at the kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's clothes and staring, At nothing with bloodshot eyes, the old cowboy's concern turned to alarm. "Boss, you look like something the cat dragged in and the dog wouldn't eat," Pete observed, with characteristic bluntness. "Where's Miss Francesca?" "Gone," Iron replied without looking up. "I sent her away." Pete digested this information with the careful consideration he applied to weather patterns and cattle behavior. "That seems like poor timing, given your current circumstances." "My current circumstances are none of her concern." "I see." Pete poured himself coffee without invitation and settled into Francesca's usual chair. "So, you figured the best way to handle losing your ranch was to also lose the woman who loves you?" Iron's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with something between fury and desperation. "She doesn't need to watch me fail. She doesn't need to be dragged down with a man who can't even pay his bills." "And you decided that for her, did you? Without giving her a choice in the matter?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Iron had spent so much energy on protecting Francesca from his problems that he had never considered whether she might want to face those problems together. The possibility that she might choose partnership over protection, struggle over security, had never entered his calculations. Meanwhile, Francesca's meetings in town were yielding unexpected results. Bank President Harrison, initially skeptical of a woman's ability to understand complex financial matters, found himself impressed by her thorough analysis and practical proposals. The partnership agreement she presented addressed every concern he might have raised about the viability of the Caldwell ranch, while providing security that far exceeded the current collateral. "This is quite comprehensive, Mrs. Moreau," Harrison admitted as he reviewed the documents. "You've clearly given this considerable thought." "I've given it everything I have," Francesca replied simply. "This ranch represents more than just a business investment to me. It represents a future I'm willing to fight for." The other ranchers she consulted, men who had known Iron for decades, provided character references that painted a picture of a hard-working, honest man who had been overwhelmed by circumstances rather than undone by poor judgment. Several offered to provide additional testimonials or even financial backing if needed, revealing a network of community support that Iron had never realized existed. "Pride's been eating at Iron for years," admitted Ben Crawford, whose spread bordered the Caldwell ranch. "Man's too stubborn to ask for help, but he's good people. We'd hate to see him lose everything over something that ain't really his fault." By the end of the week, Francesca had assembled a comprehensive rescue plan that addressed every aspect of Iron's financial crisis. The partnership agreement would provide immediate capital to bring all accounts current, while her connections to Eastern markets could help Iron get better prices for his cattle. More importantly, the arrangement would legitimize their relationship in the eyes of the community, making her not a charity case or a kept woman, but an equal partner in a legitimate business enterprise. The only obstacle was Iron himself, Tommy. Jackson brought word from the ranch that Iron had refused to see the bank representatives who had come to discuss modified terms. He had also turned away potential buyers who wanted to view the property, as if accepting the inevitability of foreclosure was preferable to exploring alternatives that might require him to compromise his independence. "He's drinking too much and eating too little," Tommy reported with worry evident in his young face. "Old Pete's trying to keep him functioning, but the boss seems determined to go down with the ship." Francesca felt her heart constrict with a mixture of love and frustration. The man she had fallen for was destroying himself rather than accept help, choosing noble self-destruction over the messy compromises that real life demanded. But she had not survived the loss of her family and built a new life from ashes, just to surrender when faced with masculine stubbornness. The final piece of her strategy came together when she visited Margaret's grave. The simple headstone bore testimony to a life cut short but deeply loved, and Francesca found herself speaking to the woman whose memory had both haunted and protected Iron for 2 decades. "I know you loved him," she said quietly, kneeling beside. "The grave to place fresh flowers. I know you'd want him to be happy, to live instead of just surviving. Help me save him from himself. Help me show him that loving again doesn't diminish what you shared." As if in answer to her prayer, inspiration struck. Francesca knew exactly how to approach Iron, how to frame the partnership in terms that would allow him to accept help without feeling diminished. It would require one final gamble, one last appeal to the man she believed still existed beneath the armor of pride and pain. Standing in the cemetery as snow began to fall, Francesca made her own vow to the memory of the woman who had first claimed Iron's heart. She would not let him lose everything out of misplaced loyalty to the past. She would fight for their future, even if it meant fighting Iron himself. Tomorrow, she would make her final stand. The morning of reckoning dawned grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over Sagebrush Ridge like a ceiling pressing down on the world. Iron stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the road that led to town with the resignation of a man awaiting execution. Today was the deadline. 60 days had passed since the foreclosure notice, and he had neither the money to save his ranch nor the will to fight any longer. The house behind him felt like a tomb, every room echoing with the ghosts of conversations he would never have again, plans that would never come to fruition. He had spent the week drinking too much and eating too little, torturing himself with memories of Francesca's laugh, the way she hummed while working, the brief happiness they had shared before his pride destroyed it all. Old Pete and Tommy had tried to maintain the ranch operations, but Iron could see the defeat in their eyes. They were loyal men, but loyalty couldn't pay bills or save land that was already lost. He had expected solitude in these final hours, had steeled himself for the quiet dignity of facing his failure alone. What he hadn't expected was the dust cloud on the horizon that announced approaching visitors, or the small caravan of wagons and riders that turned into his yard just after sunrise. Bank President Harrison led the procession, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled from the early morning ride. Behind him came Ben Crawford and 2 other neighboring ranchers, their faces grim with purpose. Iron recognized Daniel Morrison and Walt Stevens, men who had worked this land almost as long as he had, who understood the cycles of drought and plenty that governed their lives. A lawyer Iron didn't recognize rode beside a clerk carrying an official-looking satchel, and at the rear of the group, straight-backed and determined, rode Francesca on a rented mare, her eyes fixed on Iron's face with an intensity that made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't name. The sight of her hit him like a physical blow. She looked thinner than when he'd last seen her, as if the strain of the past week had carved away everything inessential, leaving only the iron core of determination that had first drawn him to her. Her traveling dress was neat and proper, her hair pinned with precise care, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of battles fought and victories hard won. "Mr. Caldwell," Harrison called out as he dismounted, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We need to talk." Iron remained on his porch, arms crossed, as the group assembled in his yard like an army preparing for siege. Every instinct told him to retreat, to refuse whatever charity they had come to offer, to maintain his dignity even as everything else crumbled around him. But something in Francesca's expression, not pity, but fierce determination, kept him rooted in place. "I believe we've already covered everything that needs covering," Iron said finally, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You'll have my answer by noon, as agreed." "Actually," Francesca said, dismounting with fluid grace, "we have a proposition that might change your answer." She carried with her the leather portfolio that had become her constant companion over the past week, and Iron felt a familiar surge of stubborn resistance. Whatever plan she had concocted, whatever strings she had pulled or favors she had called in, he wouldn't be bought like a prize bull at auction. His pride was all he had left, and he would cling to it even if it meant losing everything else. "I had told you," he began, You told me you wouldn't accept charity, Francesca interrupted, climbing the porch steps until she stood directly in front of him. This close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the evidence of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. But he could also see something else, a resolve that matched his own stubbornness, tempered by a wisdom he was only beginning to understand. This isn't charity, Iron. This is business. She opened the portfolio and withdrew a document thick with legal language and official seals. The paper was crisp and official, covered with the kind of meticulous detail that spoke of hours of careful preparation. I propose a partnership between Francesca Moreau and Titus Caldwell, equal owners, in the Sagebrush Ridge Cattle Company. I provide capital investment and business management expertise. You provide land, livestock, and operational knowledge. Profits and losses shared equally, decisions made jointly, responsibilities divided according to ability and preference. Iron stared at the papers, his mind reeling. Not a loan, not a gift, not a rescue, a partnership. An arrangement that would preserve his dignity while solving his problems, that would make Francesca his equal rather than his benefactor. The legal language was precise and comprehensive, addressing every concern he might have raised about maintaining his independence and authority. The bank has reviewed and approved this arrangement, Harrison added, stepping forward with documents of his own. Mrs. Moreau's financial credentials are impeccable, and the business plan she's presented is both comprehensive and realistic. We're prepared to restructure your debt under terms that would make the operation viable for the long term. Harrison's endorsement carried weight in the community. The man was conservative by nature, careful with the bank's money, not given to approving risky ventures out of sentiment. If he was backing this arrangement, it meant Francesca had presented him with more than just good intentions. She had shown him a viable path forward. Furthermore, Ben Crawford interjected, his weathered face serious but hopeful, several of us have agreed to provide character references and additional backing if needed. We've all reviewed the proposal, Iron. It's sound. More than sound, it's exactly what this ranch needs to not just survive, but thrive. Walt Stevens nodded his agreement. We've known you for 20 years, Iron. You're the best cattleman in the valley, but even the best can't fight drought and falling prices alone. This partnership gives you the resources to weather the storms and take advantage of the opportunities. Iron felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall of isolation he had maintained for so long. These men, his neighbors, his peers, had come not to witness his humiliation, but to offer support. They saw his crisis not as personal failure, but as the kind of economic challenge that could befall any rancher, the sort of problem that neighbors helped neighbors solve. Daniel Morrison, who had always been a man of few words, stepped forward. My spread's half the size of yours, Iron, but I've had good years and bad. The difference between success and failure often comes down to having the right partner at the right time. Seems to me you found yours. Why? Iron asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Why would you do this? Why would any of you care whether I save this place or lose it? Because Margaret would want us to, Francesca said simply, and the mention of his late wife's name in this context, not as a barrier to the future but as a blessing on it, took his breath away. Because love doesn't end with death, and the life you built with her deserves to continue. Because running a ranch alone is hard, but building a future together is what marriage is supposed to be about. The words hit Iron like a physical blow, stripping away the last of his defenses. For 20 years, he had told himself that loyalty to Margaret's memory required him to suffer alone, to reject anything that might diminish the purity of his grief. But Francesca was offering something different, not replacement, but continuation. Not forgetting, but growing. The papers give you equal say in all major decisions, the lawyer explained, producing additional documents from his case. This isn't Mrs. Moreau buying you out or taking over. It's two people pooling their resources to build something neither could achieve alone. The legal structure protects both parties' interests while creating a framework for genuine partnership. Iron took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, scanning the precise legal language that would transform his solitary struggle into a shared endeavor. Every clause seemed designed to preserve his dignity while providing the support he desperately needed. It wasn't rescue, it was collaboration between equals who brought different strengths to a common cause. "There's something else," Francesca said quietly, producing one final document, a preliminary agreement with Morrison cattle buyers in Denver. They're interested in a long-term contract for premium beef at prices 20% above current market rates. The partnership would have the resources to meet their quality standards and delivery schedules. The business opportunity she presented was exactly the kind of forward-thinking arrangement Iron had dreamed of, but never had the capital to pursue. It represented not just survival, but prosperity, not just maintaining the status quo, but building something better than what had come before. Iron looked around at the faces surrounding him, determined, hopeful, supportive. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone with his problems. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had people willing to stand with him against whatever challenges lay ahead. "Where do I sign?" he asked quietly, and Francesca's smile was brighter than the winter sun breaking through the clouds. The signing of the partnership papers took place at Iron's kitchen table, the same surface where he and Francesca had shared so many meals and conversations that now seemed like treasures from another lifetime. The worn wood bore the scars of 20 years of solitary use, cup rings, knife marks, the accumulated evidence of a man eating alone. But today, it would witness the kind of ceremony that transformed legal documents into promises, business arrangements into bonds of trust. As Iron pressed pen to paper, each signature feeling weightier than the last, he could feel 20 years of isolation and stubborn pride dissolving like morning frost under the warm sun. Each initial was an act of trust, each flourish a small surrender of the independence that had both protected and imprisoned him. The lawyer guided them through each document with professional precision, explaining clauses and contingencies while the assembled witnesses watched with the solemn attention usually reserved for weddings or baptisms. Francesca signed her portions with steady hands, but Iron noticed the slight tremor in her fingers that spoke of the enormous risk she was taking. She was betting her financial future on his ability to be the partner she believed him to be, staking her security on the success of an operation that had been failing just hours before. The magnitude of her faith in him was both humbling and terrifying. When Harrison began reviewing the debt restructuring documents, the true scope of Francesca's commitment became clear. She wasn't just investing in the ranch's future. She was personally guaranteeing loans that would take years to repay, assuming responsibility for obligations that weren't originally hers. The bank president's respect for her financial acumen was evident in the favorable terms he was offering, but those terms came with the understanding that Francesca was putting everything she owned at risk for a man who had recently thrown her out of his house. "Mrs. Moreau has provided personal guarantees totaling more than twice the amount needed to satisfy your current obligations," Harrison explained, his tone carrying both admiration and mild disbelief. "She's also established a line of credit for operational improvements and emergency expenses. The partnership will have the financial stability to weather any reasonable crisis." Iron felt his throat constrict as the reality of her sacrifice sank in. "Francesca, you can't. This is too much. If something goes wrong, you could lose everything." "So could you," she replied simply, meeting his gaze with calm determination. "That's what partnership means, Iron. We succeed together or we fail together. No more shouldering burdens alone." Ben Crawford cleared his throat, drawing attention to additional documents he'd been carrying. "There's more, Iron. Walt and Daniel and I have been talking with some of the other ranchers in the valley. We want to propose a cooperative arrangement for purchasing feed and supplies, sharing transportation costs, maybe even coordinating our cattle sales for better prices." Walt Stevens nodded enthusiastically. "We've all been struggling with the same problems: isolation, limited resources, volatile markets. Francesca's business plan showed us how much stronger we could all be if we worked together instead of competing with each other. The vision they presented was revolutionary for a region where independence and self-reliance had always been considered the highest virtues. Iron could see the logic in their proposal, the way collective action could benefit everyone involved, but it required a fundamental shift in thinking that challenged everything he'd believed about success and survival. It would mean regular meetings, shared decision-making, coordinated planning, Daniel Morrison added, not easy for men used to calling their own shots. But the potential benefits: better prices, shared expertise, mutual support during hard times. It could transform the entire valley. Iron looked around the table at faces that had become more familiar and dear than he'd ever expected. These weren't just business associates offering a commercial arrangement. They were neighbors who had watched him struggle in silence for too long. Friends who cared enough to risk their own resources on his recovery. When the last document was signed and witnessed, a cheer went up from the assembled group that echoed across the ranch like a victory cry. Bank President Harrison shook hands with both partners, his relief evident as he tucked the papers into his official case. The restructured debt would be manageable, the operation sustainable, and the bank's investment secure for the foreseeable future. "I believe this calls for a celebration," Ben Crawford announced, producing a bottle of whiskey from his saddlebag with the flourish of a magician revealing his finest trick. "It's not every day we get to witness the saving of the Caldwell ranch." But even as toasts were offered and congratulations exchanged, Iron found his attention fixed on Francesca, who stood quietly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In her eyes, he saw not triumph, but something deeper: relief, love, and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had fought for what mattered and won. But there was also exhaustion there, the cost of the battles she'd fought on his behalf, the sleepless nights and difficult conversations that had made this moment possible. The celebration continued for another hour, with neighbors sharing stories of their own struggles and recoveries, making plans for the cooperative arrangements they'd discussed, and offering advice gleaned from their own experiences with hardship and success. Old Pete, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen doorway, finally stepped forward with tears in his weathered eyes. "In 30 years of working this ranch," the old cowboy said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've seen plenty of hard times and a few good ones. But I ain't never seen anything like what happened here today. This isn't just about money or business arrangements. It's about what happens when good people refuse to let one of their own fail alone." Tommy Jackson nodded vigorously, his young face bright with excitement. "Does this mean we get to keep our jobs, boss?" Iron's laugh was the first genuinely joyful sound he'd made in weeks. "Son, if this partnership works the way Mrs. Caldwell has planned it, we're all going to have more work than we know what to do with." The casual use of Francesca's married name drew smiles from everyone present, an acknowledgement of the relationship that had made this business partnership possible. But Iron noticed that Francesca's cheeks flushed slightly at the designation, and he realized that despite everything they'd shared, they hadn't actually discussed the question of marriage since his proud rejection of her help. Harrison was the last to go, pausing on the porch to address both partners with the formal gravity that made him such an effective banker. "I hope you understand what you've accomplished here today. This isn't just about saving a ranch. It's about proving that communities can take care of their own when pride doesn't get in the way. You've given the rest of us a model for how neighbors should support each other." As the dust from the departing wagons settled and silence returned to the ranch yard, Iron and Francesca found themselves alone for the first time since their devastating argument. The weight of everything that had happened, the near loss of the ranch, the humbling acceptance of help, the magnitude of Francesca's faith in their future, settled between them like a bridge they would have to cross together. "We need to talk," Ian said quietly, understanding that the legal partnership they'd just created was only the beginning of the conversations they needed to have. Francesca nodded, her composure finally showing cracks that revealed the strain she'd been carrying. "Yes, we do. About what this means, about what we want from each other, about whether we can build something real from the wreckage of the last few weeks." The honesty in her voice, the acknowledgement that their relationship had been damaged even as their business partnership was being born, gave Ian hope that they could find their way back to each other with the same determination that had saved his ranch. Spring came early to Sagebrush Ridge that year, as if the land itself was eager to celebrate new beginnings. The wedding of Titus, Ian Caldwell, and Francesca Moreau took place on a Saturday in April, when the prairie grass was green and tender, and wildflowers painted the meadows in shades of hope. The ceremony was held on the ranch, in the shade of the old cottonwood trees that had witnessed 30 years of Caldwell family history. Pastor Williams from the town church officiated, his words carrying across the gathered crowd like a benediction on the warm spring air. Nearly everyone from Sagebrush Ridge had come to witness the union, filling the yard with faces that reflected genuine joy at seeing their stoic neighbor finally allow happiness back into his life. Francesca wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her figure, and updated with lace from Margaret's own wedding gown, a gesture that Ian had suggested, and that spoke to his newfound understanding of how love could honor the past while embracing the future. She carried wildflowers instead of hothouse roses, simple prairie blooms that matched the unpretentious beauty of the setting. Ian stood waiting for her in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since. But today, it felt different, not a garment of mourning, but of celebration, transformed by context and intention. When Francesca appeared on old Pete's arm, walking slowly across the grass toward her future, Ian felt his heart swell with an emotion so pure and strong it nearly overwhelmed him. The vows they exchanged were personal and heartfelt, written together during long evenings of conversation and planning. They spoke of partnership and patience, of second chances and hard-won wisdom, of building something together that would honor their separate pasts while creating a shared future. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Ian said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "In prosperity and hardship, in laughter and tears, in the daily work of building a life and the larger work of building a legacy, I promise to trust you with my struggles and share with you my joys. I promise to stand beside you, not behind you or in front of you," Francesca replied, her words equally firm and clear. "I promise to bring my strength to your weakness and to lean on your strength when I falter. I promise to love not just the man you are, but the man you're still becoming." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their friends and neighbors echoed across the valley like thunder rolling off the mountains. Ian kissed his bride with gentle reverence, tasting salt from her tears of joy, and feeling his own eyes grow damp with emotion he no longer tried to hide. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music provided by a fiddle player from town and dancing on a platform the ranch hands had constructed specially for the occasion. Ian, who hadn't danced in 20 years, surprised everyone, including himself, by leading Francesca through a waltz that was both graceful and heartfelt, his large frame moving with unexpected elegance as they swayed to music that seemed to come from the stars themselves. Old Pete gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes, speaking of loyalty and friendship, of the courage required to love again after loss, and of the way some people were meant to find each other across time and circumstance. Ben Crawford raised his glass to the prettiest partnership in cattle country, and even Bank President Harrison was moved to observe that some business arrangements were blessed by more than just good accounting. As the evening wound down and the guests began to take their leave, Ian and Francesca found themselves standing in the doorway of their home, watching the last wagons disappear into the darkness. The house behind them glowed with warm light, and for the first time in decades, it truly felt like a home rather than just a shelter. "No regrets?" Ian asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist and marveling at how naturally the word came. "To him, only that we waited so long to be honest with each other," Francesca replied, leaning into his embrace. "Think of all the time we wasted being afraid." They moved inside together, but not before Ian paused to look at the family photograph that now graced the mantelpiece, a new portrait of himself and Francesca displayed beside the old one of him and Margaret. The two images didn't compete or contradict. Instead, they complemented each other, telling the story of a heart large enough to hold both chapters of a life fully lived. In the months that followed, the Sagebrush Ridge Cattle Company flourished under their joint management. Francesca's business acumen and Eastern connections brought new markets and better prices, while Ian's expertise and reputation ensured the quality and reliability that customers valued. More importantly, they worked together with an easy compatibility that surprised everyone who knew Ian's previous reputation for solitary stubbornness. The rocking chair on the porch no longer sat empty. On summer evenings, it held both of them, Ian's large frame accommodating his wife as they watched the sun set over their shared land and planned for futures that seemed brighter with each passing day. They spoke of children they might adopt, of improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, of the way their partnership had taught them that some things were stronger when shared rather than carried alone. As autumn painted the grasslands gold and red, Francesca surprised Iron with news that would complete their transformation from two wounded souls seeking shelter to a family building a legacy. The child they had dared to hope for was on the way, due to arrive with the spring that would mark their first anniversary. Iron received the news with wonder and gratitude, understanding finally that life's greatest gifts often came not when you demanded them, but when you had learned to deserve them. As he held his wife in the chair he had built for another woman in another lifetime, he offered a silent prayer of thanks to Margaret, whose memory had taught him how to love, and to Francesca, whose courage had taught him how to love again. Past and the future existed together in perfect harmony, like two melodies combining to create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone.